A very, very warm welcome to my YouTube today. Our journey is going to take us to the far west of Cornwall, and the airfield is RAF Portreath during its wartime service. RAF Portreath had a very, quite a very busy, active life from 1941 to 1945, and bearing in mind it was down in the far west of Cornwall, it was not the most accessible airfield to get to. Often, there'd be a couple of hours of flying time to get down there, but all the aircrew had to come by either by train or being brought down in lorries. So it was a fair old journey to get there. RAF Portreath was opened as an RAF Fighter Command sector station and an overseas air dispatch unit on the 7th of March 1941, and it was part of 10 Group, whose headquarters was at RAF Box at Corsham. Prior to this, the sector station had been at St Eval. An unusual feature of the station was 4 tarmac runways, although only the main runway was suitable for anything other than a single-seat fighter. Twin blast pens and 4 blister hangars were spread out around the perimeter track, and at a later date 4 T2 hangars were also built on the technical site. 263 Squadron was the first to arrive at Portreath, providing defence for the western approaches. They were flying the Westland Whirlwind Mk fighter. They were soon replaced by Spitfires as Portreath took an active role as a fighter station. On May the 11th, 1941, a fighter sector operations centre was opened at Tahiti Barton Farm, just 2 miles southwest of the airfield. On opening, the station took added responsibility for the satellite airfields at St Mary's, Scilly Isles, RAF Perranporth and RAF Bredanich. In early May, Bristol Blenheim light bombers arrived at Portreath, and their airfield was used as an advanced base for raids on France, although the main runway was only just long enough for a heavy loaded Blenheim to take off. Early in the war, RAF Kemble became host to a unit that prepared aircraft for the service overseas, mainly the Middle East. Number 1 Overseas Aircraft Preparation Unit was established at Kemble to carry out the task of modifying aircraft to operate in these regions. After modification, the aircraft were flown to Portreath, from whence they were dispatched to their destination. Portreath's geographical position making it an ideal departure point for North Africa. October 1941, a detachment of the Honeybourne-based ferry training unit was established at Portreath too, to organise ferry flights for crews that had been trained for overseas flying duties. The influx of crews during this period stretched the available hutted accommodation to its limit, and a colony of tents was established on the hillside to provide additional crew quarters. During 1942, the airfield was selected to take part in Operation Cackle, which involved the supply of aircraft aircrew and supplies for the US Air Force, the US 12th Air Force, to take part in Operation Torch, which was the Anglo-American invasion of French North Africa. In the first half of 1943, Portreath was almost entirely committed to ferry operations. In July 1943, a new sector operations centre was opened at Tregear Hill, overlooking Portreath, 1 mile southwest of the airfield. However, it was little concerned with the operations at Portreath, which now mainly consisted of coastal strike and anti-fighter operations over the Bay of Biscay. Portreath remained busy during the build-up to D-Day, when 248 Squadron, equipped with Mosquito 6s, mounted 5 separate operations from Portreath. Now, if I may, I'd like to read some parts from Wing Commander Mick Enzer. He was a New Zealander, born and bred in rural Canterbury, learned to hunt, shoot and fix engines while still a boy. I was good at spotting deer, he recalls. My brothers always said that if I couldn't find a deer, there weren't any about. As a coastal command pilot, Mick would prove very able to spot U-boats sooner than most other men. He learned to fly in New Zealand and joined 500 Squadron at Bircham Newton, Norfolk in 1941. Having survived several dangerous operations in Blenheims over the North Sea and the French coast. Mick first earned fame on his second Hudson operation in 1942, attacking 3 German ships at mast height. First flight at Bircham Newton was on the 28th of July, 20 minutes as second pilot in a Blenheim 4. During August he made half a dozen further local flights before his first operation in a Blenheim 4. On the 12th of August, he began a letter to his mother telling her that Roddy McCracken was based at a nearby airfield. "I flew over to see him yesterday. He's looking very fit and doing very well." In his ignorance, Mick thought Roddy rather lucky that he doesn't have to do any night flying, whereas ours is more than half night work. Mick's squadron carried out some night flying training from a small grass satellite field at Langham, 14 miles to the northeast on the north coast of Norfolk. Crews usually travelled to and fro in a splendid vintage Bentley motorcar belonging to Flight Lieutenant Duff Mitchell, who was in charge of training, and they stayed overnight in a fine old requisitioned country house, Langham Hall. On one dark night, however, they laid out the flare path of gooseneck flares pointed straight at the only house for miles around. Pat Green had just taken off, and one propeller and one undercarriage leg hit the chimney of that house. Somehow he got safely down after a very sweaty circuit, and went next morning to apologise to the lady owner, who had been asleep in bed until her chimney got in the way of his Blenheim. Even though pieces of the chimney had actually burst through the ceiling and scattered around the bed, she welcomed him warmly, saying with a smile, "I thought it was the last trump, and I'm glad to learn it wasn't." Later, perhaps because of Pat's mishap, a better satellite field at Docking, only a couple of miles north of Bircham Newton, became their overnight base. After his alarming debut, Mick did not fly in operations again for nearly a month, until the 11th of September, and he and his crew carried out their second operation in a Blenheim 4. On the 15th, several crews flew south to RAF Harrowby on the edge of Yelverton village, about 5 miles inland from Plymouth. "I've been down on the south coast for a while now," Mick told his mother on the 22nd of September, "doing night raids on ports and day sweeps now and again. It's been rather good fun because we're all living in a hotel, and we park our planes almost in the centre of the town, about 50 yards from our hotel. I came back to here, Bircham Newton, the day before yesterday to get my machine repaired, and so I'm having a bit of a quiet spell." Listen for this short story about the Mick's flying in Norfolk. The reason is that when they transferred to RAF Harrowby, they were also flying operations out of RAF Portreath, and some of the Blenheims you can see here in the footage taken during their wartime service. Might be worth a mention, as RAF Portreath was a staging airfield for aircraft that were transiting to North Africa and beyond, and one of the aircraft types was the Bristol Beaufighter, and the record states here that 18 aircraft made an uneventful hop from RAF Honolulu to RAF Portreath, but the unofficial diaries note otherwise. Portreath, for some, is reached after a flight of about 1 hour and 10 minutes. By all generally, that is, except Phil Kendall and Charlie Hill, whose combined navigational skills had enabled them to visit the Scilly Isles and Portsmouth before joining the others at Portreath after 2 hours and 40 minutes of flying. The official record then briefly states that the next stop was to be Gibraltar, and the naval charts were to be issued, accompanied by a brief revision of the difference between nautical miles and statute miles. But the unofficial record is again more revealing and emphasising the fact that both Spain and Portugal, whilst nominally neutral throughout World War II, were deemed hostile in terms of both political sympathy and military intelligence sharing. An American officer dished out some puckagen on what to do or not to do when taken prisoner, or in the event of a forced landing in Portugal or Spain, and we also learned how to outstare any Arab who might show himself reluctant to continue the friendly conversation which we hoped would follow our introductory "Salam alaikum," peace upon you. Now, to continue the journey on the long leg between the Scillies and Cape Finisterre, the cloud base varied from 1,000 to 3,000 feet, but instead of deteriorating as had been predicted, the weather steadily improved. And as we went southward, and good time was had by all, rumour has it that squadron leader Player and pilot officer Phillips espied some Arado seaplanes en route, but considered it beneath their dignity to join the battle with such inferior prey. The Arado seaplane was a German float plane that was used during the Second World War. The squadron landed at Gibraltar. They were briefed that the next step would be Maison Blanche, now Hurari, or Demine, near Algiers. 17 of the 18 Beaufighters made the hop on the 15th, Flying Officer Gloucester and Pilot Officer Oswald, pilot and navigator, being delayed by water in the fuel before they took off from Gibraltar. The flight from Gibraltar to Maison Blanche was in formations of 3, unlike the journey from Portreath to Gibraltar, when each aircraft had flown solo, and the unofficial diary records the formation flying might have been uneventful had it not been for the Führer's last-minute decision to carry Aldous lamps, having waggled his dihedral tailplane in the most cunning manner, thereby attempting to induce numbers 2 and 3 of his section to form line astern, line abreast, and the Vic Echelon port or Echelon starboard, according to the violence of the wiggling or some of the other mysterious code. And having failed to produce that desired result, the Führer, their commanding officer. Now, I read again from Wing Commander Mick Enser's book that on this occasion, when they were flying as a detachment, they were based at Harrowby from the 15th of September to the 6th of October 1941 in their Blenheims. He described it as a very odd period, thought Pat. We only darted around in our Blenheims over the Channel and the Bay of Biscay just as fruitlessly, but also made some night attacks on such places as St Nazaire, quite absurd. On arriving at Harrowby, Pat recorded in his diary, no officers' mess ready, no quarters ready, absolute shambles. After the AOC of 19 group came out from Plymouth, we moved into a hotel in the village. It was in fact a temperance hotel, but no objection was raised when some crates of beer were carried in. In any case, there was a good pub just across the road and an even better one less than a couple of miles away. The secondary runway ran slightly downhill and finished a few yards short of the main road, separated from it by a few strands of wire and pointing more or less straight down the village street. There were several dispersal pans for aircraft at the end of the runway, and since the hotel was only some 50 yards away, some of the intrepid young aviators were rather inclined to show off by clumping to and fro in their flying kit. They were able to get away with this because, as Frank Rees recorded, few villagers had either seen aircraft or airmen at close range before, and they were all mightily impressed by their exotic visit. D-Day, operations over the Bay of Biscay were few and far between, and following the last operation on September the 7th, 1944, the coastal squadrons were transferred to Banff in Scotland, and the station went quickly into decline, just leaving the air-sea rescue squadrons and one overseas air dispatch unit. The air-sea squadrons left in February 1945. The last flying unit left at Portreath in May 1945. The station was transferred to 44 Group Ferry Service of Transport, and a Transport Command briefing school was established on the airfield, but this was short-lived. An overland route was now available to the Middle East, and with Portreath unable to handle transatlantic traffic, movements rapidly declined. The overseas available department unit was transferred to number 2 unit at RAF St Morgan in September 1945. The briefing school left on the 8th of October, and air traffic control ceased on the following day. Hopefully, I always say in hope, that you enjoyed this brief look at the wartime services at RAF Portreath, and you can see here a very brief photograph of the Portreath as it looks today. Now, the history of RAF Portreath after the Second World War became quite extended, and that would make a completely different film. But in any event, I look forward to seeing you on the next film, and wish you all the very best. Take the greatest of care, and have a ponder on subscribing. Cheers for now.